Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Bharti Kansara, Vice President of American Friends of SOAS, London University, and I am delighted to introduce our 15th webinar since the COVID pandemic began. Today, we are focusing on our extraordinary SOAS library collections, led by our distinguished Chief Librarian, Oliver Urquhart Irvine, who will be in conversation with a recent SOAS graduate, Ashley Crawford. This webinar is also the first salvo in the 50th anniversary celebration next year of the SOAS Library, one of the top 5 research libraries in the UK. The webinar will focus on how best to deploy the unique and rich treasures of our library for the study of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, so as to provide the greatest possible access to both academic scholars and the public at large. Our Chief Librarian, Oliver Urquhart Irvine, took up his post in January 2019. Previously, he was the librarian and deputy keeper of the Royal Archives from 2014 to 2019. Prior to that, he was head of the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership and of the British Library's Department of Asian and African Studies. He began his career in books and manuscripts at Christie's and Maggs Brothers. Ashley Crawford is originally from San Francisco, California, and is currently completing her MA in the History of Art at SOAS. Her primary areas of research are Buddhist art and disability studies, including curatorial universal design in museums. Previously, she has earned degrees in art history and musicology from SOAS, Christ Church, Oxford, and Scripps College. The SOAS special collections include amazing rare finds, such as letters dated 1777 in Thai from the King's Minister to Captain Francis Light, Superintendent of Penang, written on amazing koi paper made from the bark of the shrub Strablus. Additionally, Professor Mary Boyce, just to give you an example of how rich our collection is, Professor Mary Boyce, who did extensive fieldwork in Iran and studied the Avesta, utilizing the medieval Middle Persian texts, has endowed the library with 3 outstanding volumes of the history of Zoroastrianism. So SOAS is a leader in Zoroastrian studies. Explore with our presenters how best to provide the widest possible access to this unique trove of library treasures. As you listen to the presentation by our Chief Librarian and the discussion that follows with Ashley Crawford, please put any questions that come to mind into the chat box, and Ashley will draw upon these in the 10-minute Q&A session following her discussion with Oliver. The webinar will end with a vote of thanks by Greg Bowie, our wonderful president of American Friends of SOAS. And without further ado, I will hand over to Oliver Urquhart Irvine.
Thank you very much, Bharti. It's very kind of you. And thank you also to Ashley as well for agreeing to moderate and be in conversation. I'm just going to share my screen now. Thank you very much. Well, it's it's afternoon here, so good afternoon, but it may be all sorts of times for all of you. So thank you very much for inviting me today. As the American Friends of SOAS, your continued support and association with the school is enormously appreciated by us all. And Americans have long been friends of SOAS, really since its inception as a school in 1916. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and thank you to everybody involved in making this happen, and thank you to all of you who've taken time out of your Saturday to come and hear this and to talk with me about the library and its future. Many of you will have very fond memories of SOAS Library and will doubtless be current users also and spent many hours amongst its open access collections. There is something very special about SOAS Library, and I was asked when I was appointed in January 2019 by the then chair of the trustees of SOAS, Marie Staunton, what is it that makes SOAS Library great? She wasn't doubting the proposition that SOAS Library is great, but she wanted to know what made a library great. And for me, the answer is simple, really. It is an answer that is true for all great libraries and museums. And that is something that brings together three different things: an abundance of internationally significant collections. That has to be a given to be a great collection. Staff with real expertise and willingness to share that expertise. And I do believe very much that our staff in SOAS Library have that expertise and have at the core of their raison d'etre willingness to share that expertise and to support and guide our students and our researchers and our users in these collections. And no less important than those first two is an exceptional and sustained history of use of the collections, reuse, and the enjoyment of its collections. And we can look at the past and we can see that clearly through the wealth of publications and indeed in SOAS research online today. But that's just as important for the future of the library also. And that enjoyment and use of the collections is also true for research, not just for researchers, but also in terms of education of our undergraduate students and postgraduate tour students, and for public engagement, and simply the pleasure really of the opportunity to access this material wherever you are in the world, whatever your interest is and whatever your research questions are. SOAS Library can of course be compared to the great libraries of the world in these areas, namely Harvard, the Library of Congress, of course the British Library, the Bodleian and so on. But it has, even though it has a much shorter history than these, it somehow has acquired its own mythology too. And I won't read out the entire quote, but I was entertained to discover a blog written by a former library user, Stephen Liddell. I don't know whether he's on this webinar or not. Recalling a story, recalling distinctly remembering seeing a sheep on the second floor of SOAS Library. Goodness knows what a sheep thought it was doing in central London, let alone on the second floor of the SOAS Library. And I'm quite sure there's a bit of myth about that. But he goes on to say something very nice, which is that what he liked about the library was that it was a place where ideas and events weren't just studied, but lived out and built upon. And that everybody, all the users and all those members of the school had a story. And he says, and as there were sons and daughters from countries near and far, there were always rumours and stories of spies and espionage. Some were the children of the elite of their countries, and others were those trying to overthrow the same elite. Well, I think that says something about just the sort of magical sort of mystery of SOAS and its collections and its library. And I find there's something very uplifting about the sound of research, and that is the sound of SOAS Library full of people independently working in intense study in the great spaces of this magnificent library. I just really want to touch a little bit upon the history, because the history helps shape for us why it is great. You'll know that SOAS is just over 100 years old. Many of you will have taken part in the centenary celebrations in 2016. And of course, SOAS was conceived and born in the First World War as a really manifestation of Imperial Britain. Its first home was the London Institution, which is a building on the left, you see on the left here in Finsbury Circus, just on the edge of the City of London. And right from the outset, at its heart, it had a library, and it was a very significant library. And there's something that I think perhaps the original founders had never anticipated, which is just how proactive and engaged SOAS is. In some ways, how left-wing also, but particularly how diverse SOAS has become, really to be the most diverse higher education institution in the UK, reflected in its library also. And so how far a journey it has been on since its foundation in 1916. Right in the heart of its foundation documents was an explicit link to the libraries of the India Office, which of course many of you will know are now the British Library, and the Library of the Foreign Office, which again the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is now King's College London, and the Morn Library just off Chancery Lane in central London. So right at its heart and its foundation were very significant associations with language libraries. It moved to the current site in the 1930s and very quickly took over the entire building. Those of you familiar with SOAS will know the senior common room, I'm sure, and you'll see here in the plan on the right that was indeed library stacks. And many of you may have spotted it in an episode of The Crown, as well as a hospital ward. And on the left is a photograph of those stacks with some of our students then using the library. But it also extended right out across the whole of the first floor, second, third, and third floors of the main college building. And there was also a bindery in the basement as well. It quickly, in other words, took over SOAS. And it had the impact, therefore, of making the place very, very cramped. And in many respects, SOAS must have felt like a library with a school attached. This cramped quarters and was very much in contrast to the preeminence that SOAS had achieved by this point. And it had achieved this dual thing of extraordinary research power and language teaching by the 60s, alongside this incredibly sort of threadbare state of being, because of it had received no capital funding at all since the Second World War. So there's been no investment in the library's facilities as such, although there have been large acquisitions made for the 20 years from the Second World War right through to the mid-1960s. And the anniversary publication for 1967, which some of you know that will be familiar with, had described it as saying that, and of course the new library hadn't been built by then, that it had become the norm at SOAS to put on a brave face and to patch, darn and let down wherever possible. And in some ways one feels the sense of the habits of thrift of the war years still being evidence of plenty at SOAS. And you see that a little bit in this photograph on the left. But it was important to understand this context, because parallel with that was this enormous revolution going on in higher education, which had a huge impact on SOAS Library. And that impact, that revolution really had three elements to it as far as SOAS Library is concerned. One of which is the appointment on the left there of C.R. Phillips, Sir Cyril Phillips. And in fact, the library building is called the Phillips Building, as you know, in revolutionizing SOAS. And in the mid-1950s, when he was appointed, I think I read some of that there were only 25 British students enrolled at SOAS at that time. Many students, of course, coming from overseas, elsewhere in the world. But he really had to make the case for the relevance of SOAS for being funded by the UK government. And he embarked on an ambitious plan, endorsed and supported by a report a few years later by Sir William Hayter, who's in the middle, that saw the massive modernisation, as it was called, of SOAS and also the School of East European Studies by the introduction of a whole range of subjects. Phillips' mission was to create 125 new academic posts over 10 years, in addition to languages. These are in history, economics, law, politics, anthropology, sociology, geography, art, archaeology, and religion. And some of these areas had already existed at SOAS by this point, and some of them are new to SOAS. But it completely transformed the landscape of SOAS ever since. And the dichotomy that is at the heart of SOAS today is it an institution that specializes in languages? Is it an institution that specializes in regions of the world? Is it an institution that specializes in disciplines seen through the prism of languages and interdisciplinary studies? Those kinds of tensions and also opportunities at SOAS are still very much the things that we're debating today in 2022, when we wonder where the next direction of the school is going to go and how to make it flourish and to keep it on a sort of process of renewal and stability. And the significance of the library was that they asked Sir Dennis Lasden, then just Dennis Lasden, to be the architect for the new library. And he was an extraordinary British modern architect from Edinburgh, and he'd built things like the South Bank Centre on the Thames. And really, I think it was a mark of the ambition of the school at the time that it built such an enormous library compared to the rest of the school, and that it commissioned a leading architect to build an incredibly modern building, this extraordinary masterpiece of concrete brutalism, and to allow it the space to expand not just the language collections, but the regional collections and the disciplinary collections, and to really set the basis for SOAS to become the UK's national research library for Asia and Africa. not any other institution in the UK which already had magnificent collections, such as the Bodleian or Cambridge, or British Library for that matter, but it was SOAS's library that became the UK's National Research Library. So that's the context really for this. Money hadn't just arrived for it though. There was a private fundraising campaign for the library, and that raised about £250,000. The new building is going to cost £1.25 million to build. That was the initial estimates for this. The UK government and the University of London were still not giving SOAS any money for capital expansion to really turn the library into this, to fulfill this extraordinary vision. So SOAS turned to private donors and foundations in the UK and US, and of course notably to the Rockefeller Foundation, and you'll recognize that in the picture on the left. The Rockefeller Foundation, as many of you may know, also had substantially supported the building of Senate House, which is next door to SOAS, and of course which is now occupied partly by SOAS, and in itself is a magnificent library, of course. It needed to not only build a new library, but also needed to demolish the entire south end of Woburn Square, which is the picture on the right. So that entire aspect of the Georgian Square, which also contains the Warburg Institute, and looks out northwards towards Gordon Square, where the current doctoral school is at SOAS, was demolished to make way for it. And many of you will have sat on the terraces that now occupy the place where those buildings are and enjoyed that view. And you may well have known or not known that there were those buildings there at the time. So Cyril Phillips wrote to Rockefeller in October 1957 and said the school's work should be related to the conditions of the time. With the rising importance of Asia and Africa in the modern world, Oriental and African studies should take their proper place as a normal part of the education of Western society. So although we may not use the word Oriental today and use the Asian and African studies, what he's saying is incredibly contemporary and relevant. And for the library, it meant that this was to be a new library relevant to the modern world, already exceptionally rich in languages, culture, and depth of collections, but to be rich across the languages of Asia and Africa, and now also across the humanities and social sciences. That is really what it has done and become, and it is a remarkable achievement in those 50 years that it has done this. At the heart of the library, therefore, are major historic research collections, particularly pre-1960s, and you'll see, having set out a little bit of this history, that those are the collections formed during its time in Finsbury Circus at the London Institution and in Bloomsbury prior to the building of the new library. It has also acquired very significant donations to its manuscripts and archive material and special collections. And then more recent material has been added in the teaching collections and in what we call the research collections. And the result is that it absolutely reflects SOAS's history. If you walk around SOAS Library today, you see encapsulated in it the history of the last 100 years of international academic excellence and endeavour and collaboration, because that is really what is on our shelves. This is not a library of a British reflection of the world, though it is unquestionably that also. It is a library of multifaceted views. And so it is absolutely true to say that whilst many other institutions with more specialist remits, looking at a particular language or a particular region, may hold greater collections in depth, although not always the case, sometimes SOAS holds such collections in greater depth than anywhere else. It is remarkable that all that excellence and all that range of rich material is available in one place, and with such broad coverage for the whole of Asia and Africa, which is an inexhaustible range of potential teaching subjects and potential research questions. This is a good example of one of these historic collections, and absolutely one of the treasures of SOAS's collections. The library has about 3,000 meters of archives and manuscripts, so that's about 2.2 miles of archives, manuscripts, and special collections. They're in all sorts of formats, codices such as this, in other words, volumes, scrolls, single sheet material, various types of support, including paper, cloth, bark, and palm leaf. And by support, I mean what the manuscript is actually written upon. Many include decorative elements such as here, or functional illuminations, diagrams, in other words. and illustrations. The manuscript collection alone is in over 130 languages, and we have very significant holdings in Arabic, in Swahili, and in the languages of Southeast and East Asia. There are over 500 original collections of archives and personal papers. They're in all sorts of media. They're largely paper-based, of course, being archives, but significant collections of photographs material, and that's not just the photographs, that includes prints, negatives, glass plates, slides, film strips, and of course audiovisual materials, cassette tapes, reels, gramophone records, 78s, as well as maps, posters, blueprints, engravings, paintings, visual arts, and of course most recently digital media, which is both born digital, in other words it had no other form at the point of creation, it was created digital, and material which is digital surrogates of existing physical objects. And of course there's artworks, textiles, and indeed some clothing too, from East Asia and Africa. The two pages here from the same manuscript, and you've probably been reading the caption whilst I've been talking. It's from a work called The Fables of Bidali. A literal translation of this title is The Lights of the Canopus. These are just 2 pages. It's a volume of fables, and on the far left you can see just down here in the sort of roundabout here, a fox looking up at a falcon that's carrying away what looks like a piece of skin. Well, the fox has lost out to the falcon, and on the right, the hunter, the man in the red clothes with the has lost his pigeons, which are flying away in a net. So it's this is an extraordinary expression of Persianate culture from the 16th century, the Christian era, and it's typical of these kinds of very high quality, visually very compelling material, really spanning 5 centuries amongst the manuscript collections. The acquisition of it is also quite interesting, and we know quite a bit about the acquisition of this manuscript. It was given to us in 1929 by a woman called Louise Ousley, who is the daughter of Walter Ousley, whose name may be familiar to many of you as a professor of Arabic, Bengali, Marathi, and Persian at the College of Fort William in India in 1825, and who went on to become superintendent of the Mysore princes in the late 1830s and early 1840s. And so you see here something, the history of which also conveys something about that completely interdependent and inseparable relations, sort of global relations that exist at the time and continue to do so today. Completely different kind of manuscript here. Again, another item about which you know a lot about is provenance. This was collected by, this is one of a group of 250 Swahili manuscripts. We've got very significant holdings relating to African languages, and perhaps the most significant in Hausa, certainly outside the Hausa-speaking regions of Africa. And we have about 250 manuscripts in Swahili. Those happen at the moment to being going through a process of recataloguing, updating catalogue entries, correcting them through a very generous gift from an individual who's supporting that project. And that's a tremendous piece of work, and we hope to make more of those available as a result of that. And among them is this manuscript of the Hamziya, a very old copy of this famous religious poem. It was collected by William Hitchens, through whom it came to SOAS. William Hitchens' note is on the left, and it may be difficult for you to read. I don't know how big your screens are, but he says this manuscript is now, and he puts in brackets 1936, 144 years old. At the time of my writing this note, it is the only copy of the Swahili Hamziya known in Europe, and the oldest Swahili manuscript known in any collection. Now, of course, that was 1936, which takes us back to the 1790s. And other discoveries have been made since then, but it speaks something to the quality of the and range of materials being collected at the time. On the right is a page from it, and you've got the Arabic as the first line and the Swahili translation second. I understand, and this is absolutely not my expertise, that it's quite a literal translation of the Arabic, and that is quite significant, I think, linguistically. So here you have something which is both important in terms of material culture, important in terms of provenance and the history of its acquisition, and is important as a document for the study of languages. And this kind of comparison of 18th century translation work is enormously valuable. Significance of printed collections, another Swahili item, just because I happen to be in that neck of the woods. This is the first, the earliest newspaper to survive from Tanzania, a very significant printed document. And when one looks at things, for example, in the British Library's collections, where there are also very significant collections of these languages, what distinguishes it between the British Library and, say, SOAS's collections, it does tend to be more, less of the official material and more of the ephemeral, or more of the kinds of material that don't tend to survive. For example, this newspaper. It's part of just over 2 kilometers of rare books and journals, so just over sort of 1.4 miles. It includes lithographs, xylographs, lots of other formats, regarded as significant because of their age or rarity and so on. And again, these date over the last 500 years and range from luxury books printed on vellum right through to ephemera and street literature. Again, another kind of object with another kind of history. China, of course, our collections have some real strengths, not least thanks to Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison was a missionary in China, in Guangzhou, and he collected modern contemporary Chinese books when he was there in the 19th century. And he wasn't a book collector or bibliophile as such, but he was interested in what was being published at the time. The work in the middle is a Chinese encyclopedia, classified encyclopedia, arranging things by 3 divisions of the universe: heaven, earth, and humanity. A complex work covering a whole range of subjects. The animal itself is a large ape, which would have had yellowish red hair. But also amongst his library, we've got a couple of papers relating to him. So on the left is a manuscript work which went on to be published, advocating the importance of teaching Chinese languages. And on the right, an account that he wrote of his journey from New York to Canton. And that particular page is dated at the top, January 1807, New York. So within what is ostensibly a collection relating to China, we also see the world reflected in these documents and items. And this really goes to the power of what the potential research of an archive is. It is capable of supporting so many different facets and disciplines. Here are papers and collections of a missionary, but in fact, actually, it would tell us so many things and does indeed has supported so many researchers over the years. Moving swiftly on, different kind of material. We've got a lot of material from missionary archives, one of our major strengths. And this has lots of printed material in it and lots of photographic material and other kinds of resources. On the left is a printed proclamation of the Queen of Madagascar, who as late as 1874 declared slavery to be illegal, and decreed that anybody engaged in slave trading would be imprisoned or executed, and that all slaves in Madagascar should be freed. And typifying that slavery wasn't just the activity, the abolition of slavery, of course, wasn't just the activity of one sort of lone white man, William Wilberforce, and we know that, of course, but the archives are rich in the evidence for that complexity of that story. And on the right, a Russian photographer unidentified taking a photograph in the early 1860s of Korean merchants outside the Russian delegation in Beijing. And again, here you have not a British voice or a British view of the world, but a Russian view of Koreans in Beijing. Moving swiftly on as we move forward slightly in time, another type of material in which SOAS Library is particularly rich is business archives, something that perhaps some of you will have used extensively, such as the archives of John Swire and Sons. But there are lots of archives relating to other kinds of organizations. The Chinese Maritime Customs, another Chinese business archive is the Chinese Government Purchasing Commission, but also archives of individuals who are prominent in those organizations who had their own sets of papers, including people such as Frederick Mays, Robert Hard, Reginald Hedgeland, and the archives of small independent businessmen and women also, Here we've got a photograph from the archives of Oswald and Dow, who were tea traders in China. Page, a trader in China, and Bood, who was an antiques dealer. And these collections are particularly rich in photographic material and personal accounts, absolutely invaluable for research. This is a purely historic archive. This takes us well into the 20th century. And one of the great distinguishing features of SOAS is the richness of its humanitarian archives for the 20th century. And I find it very difficult to think of another library in the UK and possibly in Europe, possibly anywhere really, which has such strengths in this area. And some of the most striking material from this, and it really touches upon very difficult subjects, includes this infamous baby killer campaign report commissioned by War on Want to expose how leading multinational food companies such as the Swiss food giant Nestle were involved in marketing powdered milk for newborn children as a healthier option than breast milk to mothers in communities without safe drinking water and sterilization facilities. And of course, on the left, the well-known example of the work, Christian Aid. We all know the Live Aid Band-Aid campaign founded in 1984 by Bob Geldof and Midyear to raise money for disaster relief in Ethiopia. And the very famous song, Do They Know It's Christmas, for the Christmas market that year. And at present, SOAS holds and makes available the historical records of a number of these kinds of organizations, including Christian Aid, War on Want, the Interchurch Aid and Refugee Service, Survival International, and the Lebanon Hospital for Mental and Nervous Disorders. And there are others too that we've acquired since we're in the process of acquiring. And we think this is absolutely one of the treasures of SOAS and a vital role of a library like SOAS to preserve and keep and make this kind of material available for now and for the future. Moving a little, sort of sticking with the 20th century, on the left there's a page of manuscript Yiddish poetry by a man called Abraham Nahum Stencil. These were, since they were donated by his great niece in the 1980s, Stencil had been born in Poland, was conscripted into the Russian army in 1918, traveled to the Netherlands in 1919, worked in the steel industry before emigrating to Berlin, where he flourished in Germany under the Bohemian lifestyle post First World War, and began writing and publishing Yiddish poetry in the sort of pioneering modernist Yiddish poetry style of the time. Established a Polish Yiddish literary group, and he stayed in Berlin until 1936 when he was tortured by the Gestapo, fled, eventually settled in London's Whitechapel area, where he published the journal Loesch and Leben, right through from 46 to 1981, and he was campaigning to keep Yiddish language alive, and he became known as the poet of Whitechapel. This is a project we've just completed with funding from the Rothschild Foundation to make it available bilingually in English and in Yiddish. And we've also, having recently established a SOAS concert series led by a colleague called Georgie Pope and SOAS Music, World Music, performed a number of works, including for the first time compositions in which Stencil's poetry has been set to music. And we see here on right a concert that took place organized by SOAS. And this comes under the library's activities concert series in September last year. There's a link that we can give you to this if you wanted to listen to it, of the concert that took place then. Moving swiftly on to the 21st century, because we are a collection that doesn't grow is a collection that becomes fossilized. We actively are promoting the opportunity for researchers to deposit material with us, and recently, for example, acquired the copies, a set of images and a set of documents and other things from two projects, one called After the Earth's Violent Sway, and also a related project called Expertise, Labour and Mobility in Nepal's Post-Conflict, Post-Disaster Reconstruction. In other words, what happened after the massive earthquakes in Nepal in April 2015 and onwards. And this is recorded in these research projects and deposited with us and with partners to SOAS in these projects, including the University of British Columbia in Canada. Photograph on the left shows houses being propped up immediately after the earthquake, and on the right, a craftsman working on creating new windows for the reconstruction of those works. And It's absolutely vital that we continue to collect this kind of material for the future relevance of SOAS Library and indeed the school and its possibilities. I just want to touch upon a very significant part of the collection that I haven't really talked about, which is the teaching and learning collections. And you may wander around the open access collections and think, well, these are just like the teaching collections of anywhere else. And of course, many of you know that they're not also. We have things on the shelves in our open access collections, which are perhaps the only known copy in Europe or elsewhere. And this is a challenge for us in terms of our conservation and care, but no other library in the world gives you such access, I would argue, to nearly 1 million items. We have many of the greatest groupings for regions or for languages under one roof. We're digitizing them and we're geotagging them. And this screenshot here from our digital library shows the worldwide distribution of more than 110 language groups represented by our online collections from SOAS. If you added into this search locations of production, printing and publication, it becomes too big actually for SOAS's servers and systems to present online at the moment, because we actually are represented everywhere in the globe, including South America, North America and elsewhere. So in order to make this easy to represent here, I've just focused on the languages. We have at the moment, for those who are interested in these kinds of things, approximately 1.2 million monograph titles on site. We've acquired in the last few years more than 250,000 ebooks. We have 98,000 serials, in other words, periodicals and journals and so on. We've up to nearly 8,000 items in our SOAS Research Online database, which is SOAS produced publications, as well as, if you added them up, 7.6 kilometers of archives and manuscripts. So that's about 5 miles worth. We have 3 kilometers of manuscript collections as well. We've digitized 35,000 items and 42,000 volumes. That's nearly 900,000 pages. And we have now digitized about 103 languages. And we intend to, by the 50th anniversary of the library building, which is next year, to have digitized more than 1 million pages in hopefully as many as 150 languages. It's all very well doing all this stuff, but you've got to ask yourself who's using it. I can tell you now that we're accessed from more than 200 countries and territories. I've just included here the top 10 on this, but who are all these countries? In fact, we've had single user visits in 2021 to 2022 from Anguilla, from the Cook Islands, from the Falkland Islands, from Micronesia, the Faroe Islands, Kiribati, the Comoros, from Liechtenstein, Marshall Islands, Nicaragua, St. Helena, and so on. And at the other end of the scale, we get thousands and thousands of uses, of course, from the US, Philippines, India, Nigeria, Kenya, Germany, France, South Africa, Tanzania, Italy, Indonesia, Japan, Canada, Hong Kong, and Turkey. And regularly, a stable top 10 includes year on year at the moment, of course, also the UK and the US, but the Philippines, India, Kenya, South Africa, and Germany. So there's a huge reach at the moment, and the challenge for us is how do we make it even more impactful as we digitize more of this material. And you may think, well, it's remarkable that the Philippines is always in the top 10. And this is down to us digitizing material and it being picked up and used in the Philippines, but also being picked up and used by our colleagues working on research, either subjects of the Philippines dimension or languages from the Philippines, or on research collaborations with Philippines institutions, for example. And that would be true also of other parts of the world, which regularly feature in the top 10. Getting close to the end, you'll be pleased to hear, so you'll be able to ask me some questions in a minute. I just wanted to touch upon what we're doing now, really, that is behind the scenes. And some of you who've been in SOAS Library recently may have gritted your teeth and thought, what's all that noise? Or read with dismay information about, please bear with us while you hear some drilling. And I don't think actually it's been too bad at all. But we are in the process of transforming the basements to install the first ever dedicated conservation studio at SOAS for our collections, and the first ever dedicated digitization studio. So a lot of our digitization at the moment has been carried on heroically by colleagues, almost working out of cupboards, but not quite. Well, this will transform their capacity to do that. And we've been very fortunate to receive funding, external funding from these projects from the AHRC, from the UKRI, from the Garfield Weston Foundation, from the Foyle Foundation, from the Wolfson Foundation, and from others. And this is part of the beginnings of a major fundraising campaign for the library to get the basics updated and get the basics right. Other things for which we are embarked on projects, for which SOAS itself is supporting, is a complete new library management system and digital assets management system. This isn't installed yet, this is work in progress, but this will also transform our capacity to provide stable working systems that deliver this wealth of material to our users wherever they are. And another project which has been ongoing, also connected to our basic works, is to completely reinstall and renew our environmental controls so that we can say the collections are being not only conserved and cared for in that way and digitized and made available, but they're also being looked after in terms of the right environmental conditions, at the right temperature and the right humidity levels, and also trying to make that environmentally responsible. We want to do more about the libraries and galleries in their public programming, and the libraries and galleries are now being brought together as a unit. And you will have seen, those who visited recently, that we've installed display cases in the ground floor of the library to show off some of the treasures in the collections from the variety of material, but also to allow spaces for students and curatorial classes to showcase their work, but also visiting exhibitions. And we've had one that's just opened now, which has been in Calcutta, about migration in the wake of partition, but migration within India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, focusing on what that effect was on the city of Calcutta. And most recently, we're looking at apprenticeships and new training opportunities for our staff. As I say, it's what makes the library great is that combination of the collections, the expertise and knowledge of the staff, and our ability to make it available and for it to be reused. And penultimately, there are lots of ways to discover our collections or plan your visit. You can share, or share things via Instagram channels. And in particular, even just the pleasure of seeing what it is that we're making available next, or to highlight things for you that perhaps you hadn't considered or weren't familiar with, because we've only just made them available, alongside treasures, of course. And the general intention is to make as much of it as possible freely available to be used wherever possible. Now, there are lots of models for doing that, and I won't go into the complexity of doing that, saying that now, but that is very much the long-term ambition. And finally, in a non-COVID world, you might have heard me speak in person after dinner, perhaps. So in the spirit of that, I end with this photograph from SOAS's own very significant archives about itself, of a photograph of a student union dinner held in the 1930s. How times have changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really fascinating. There's always so much more to learn about the library. Yeah, so you told us so much information about the library's history and the collections and the work it does today. I was interested if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and the path that led you to the library, and a bit more just about your time at the library.
Gosh, yes. I remember going to a careers fair when I was a student at school, and expressed an interest in books to the careers consultant. And I think careers advice has changed out of all recognition since then. My parents got a letter saying, apparently Oliver wants to be a bookkeeper. So somewhere along the line, they'd mistaken my interest in books for being an accountant. I think from the outset, I was interested in it. My grandmother had a bookshop. I had a cousin who was a librarian at Southampton and involved in the development of a cataloguing system called Mark. And so I'd always been interested in it. But I followed an unusual route. I went into the commercial world first and worked as an auction house as a book specialist, and then as a book dealer in Mayfair in London. And whilst I was there, I studied law also part-time in the evenings. And when a job came out of the British Library to work on cultural restitution and repatriation, an interest in the history of collecting and in the legal aspects of ownership and restitution, repatriation, and knowledge of the marketplace meant that I thought this would be a great thing to do. So I spent 8 years at the British Library, really working on the British Library's provenance and its history, And eventually, via Windsor Castle, that led to SOAS, oddly enough. Not a career path I think I could ever have quite predicted, but I'm fortunate to have worked really with some absolutely astonishing collections and some amazing colleagues.
Given the different natures of the British Library and the SOAS Library, how would you compare your time working there?
Well, the British Library is the most extraordinary collection on a kind of sort of simply unimaginable scale,
Right.
but very different from SOAS. It has this curious remit as the British, effectively the British National Library. So it is not explicitly part of the higher education sector. It's not explicitly part of the education sector, and it's also not a museum. Yet it has the capacity to support and to serve all these areas, and it is also a manifestation of the British civil service. So it's quite a sort of unusual place to be. But the sheer number of users, of course, is a feature of working with the British Library. I think what I find so compelling, or the difference between that and working at SOAS, is that SOAS is so library as a university library, but also with this national library, has such a close relationship to its users and to its students, and that we see so many of our students, day after day, week after week, or the same people. We might never speak to them, they might never speak to us, or we might have a very close working relationship with them. And that is just really, really, I think, very sort of enriching for us as staff, and very sort of enlivening, really. So I think that's a sort of one contrast, perhaps.
Yes, that actually leads to another question I had. I was wondering how you balance and manage those two very, very different functions that the library has.
It is a tension, because our SOAS is a small university, relatively speaking, with 5,000 students, and you would never budget for a library the size of SOAS's library on a university that size. So, but unquestionably, our primary, they're not mutually exclusive, but our first duty has got to be to SOAS students, really. It's an enormous teaching collection and research collection, and at whatever point you are in your research, we've got to provide you with a safe, comfortable place to work with functioning Wi-Fi and a sort of home from home, really. And that's really important, and that's a function of a library that exists without even having any collections in it. Are we welcoming, and can you get what you want from us? And in that sense, all a library has to do is to provide a place to work, and functioning facilities, and probably access to coffee, although we'd rather you didn't drink it in the library.
Of course.
But the national role, I think, is very interesting, because it's not a national role that we play in relation to the rest of the library sector. In other words, we don't see ourselves as necessarily needing to forge a relationship for the sector in terms of library leadership. What we see ourselves very much is that we are part of the landscape in which a researcher who is asking a question about food poverty or gender studies or whatever it is, or your own area of research interest, disability, will go to a number of institutions, and we are one of them, and our service must be as good as the very best anywhere else, and access to our collections must be as good as anywhere else for our users. So we see ourselves as part of that international provision of resources in areas in which we are expert and specialist.
Yes, absolutely. You were talking a bit earlier in the presentation about Sir Philip's writing to Rockefeller in 1957, saying that the school's work should be related to the conditions of the time. So my question is a bit multifaceted. The first part of it is, how do you think the conditions of the time have changed since he wrote then? How do you think the school's work now relates to that change, and how does the library support the school in that?
Well, I think it's changed a lot, and also in some ways not at all. I mean, the big questions today about global sustainability and global development goals, and the really huge shift economically, geopolitically, and economically in parts of the world that are still absolutely the core of what SOAS does, means that SOAS has no less, and if anything, an even more significant remit as an institution today than it's ever had. And in fact, it's the only UK institution in its foundation charter which has this regional remit spelt out, as well as a remit for languages, and a requirement on the board of trustees to ensure there is a special commitment to languages. I think in some ways that what Sir Cyril Phillips was probably referring to implicitly was that it wasn't enough for SOAS just to study languages.
Of course.
That languages were absolutely fundamental, but that alongside languages, it was equally valid to understand civilization and culture, and to create an environment in which you could study history and be required to study a language for the region in question or for the country in question. So he was probably referring to sort of politics at the time, when there was this anxiety about the role of Britain in the world, the role of an institution like SOAS, pressure on funding still after the war, and a need to essentially modernize or close. And so I think, SOAS itself has been through a slightly existential crisis in recent years, where it has wondered whether it's got the means to carry on. And the current strategy espoused by our new director Adam Habib about partnerships with the Global South, by which I don't think he means a geographical region. I think Global South is probably everywhere. Our need to focus on research intensivity as well as excellence in learning and teaching, I think is going to shape us for the next few years. So I think, I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but I see no difficulty in articulating the role of the library in that.
Absolutely, for sure.
in that environment.
So as Bharti mentioned in the beginning, I'm writing my dissertation on curatorial design, specifically universal design and accessibility in museums. So that's a bit of an interdisciplinary field, very, very niche topic. So I was wondering, as there are more interdisciplinary fields popping up and a lot more research topics in those areas, what advice would you have for students researching in a library such as SOAS for very, very niche topics that are much newer?
I think take the most creative approach possible to the way in which you search for things. I would say absolutely engage with our librarians who often deal with several different subjects at once, and who have between them have many decades of expertise in the collections, and will help you. And the same for special collections. And don't forget about special collections in your use of the library. That's absolutely available to students to research. But you're quite right to make this point that a word like disability, which has a specific legal meaning, of course, under the Equalities Act 2010, as well as a sort of wide meaning in the ordinary English meaning to it, is not something that is necessarily going to appear on our catalogues as a tag for which things are going to happen. So
yes, I have experienced that a bit. Yeah.
And to think that, although again, I think a sort of like disability, and this is something which you'll be far more expert than I am. Of course, it's not just the sort of medical aspects, but the social aspects of it. So it's to look at things where, for example, we might have medical papers, not because you want to find it as a medical thing, but where you are thinking about actually where people are doing things that are about the wellness of people. Are they also along the way writing about things? And some of the most extraordinary research projects I've seen on the archives, SOAS and other archives, have been where people are looking for the hidden voices, where you unearth what has happened or what is happening by what is not said. That's a really difficult and time-consuming thing to do. So I think it's think creatively, think outside the box. Remember that the words of today aren't the words that I have saying might have been even catalogued 20 years ago, or the words might have been used in language, and seek advice and expert guidance from from the team in the library, our librarians, our reader assistants, and our special collection staff.
That's great advice. Thank you. And thank you for answering my questions. I think now we can turn it to the audience. So I will take a look at the chat. Bharti has written in the first question. She says, what materials do you have on the famous Sassoon family, the Rothschilds of the East?
Well, I might have to go away and answer that question yeah, I might have to go away and answer that question because the collections are enormous, and I'm not quite sure I'm familiar with them all. I don't know the answer off the top of my head to the Sassoon family. I mean, they must appear somewhere in our collections. It can't possibly be the case that they don't. And my special collections, probably colleagues, if they were watching this, would probably be hanging their heads in shame that I couldn't answer you, Bharti. So I'll take that one away and happily write to you about it. I think it's a very good point, and I'm sure they appear not just in their own right, but they will appear in the business archives. that we hold, and they will appear in some of the personal archive collections also, through correspondence and through their existence in that way.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So we have another question, written by an alum. That's exciting, by Larry, who was saying, you mentioned that the SOAS library has about 98,000 serials. The big problem here at the UC Berkeley Library has been the sharply increasing cost of serials, since buying a book is a one-time expense, but subscribing to a journal is a continuing cost that keeps going up and up. Since about the 1990s, the decline of state funding, the library budget has been greatly strained, forcing discontinuing of some journals. Has this been a problem at SOAS?
Thanks, Larry. Great question. You touched upon something there, which is, yes, it has been a problem at SOAS. There's no question. The average cost of a printed book is somewhere in about £60 or so, and the average cost of an ebook, for example, is 120, 130 pounds now. And so actually electronic resources are much more expensive than printed resources from the outset. And that's true of periodicals and serials as well. And with, I think, a sort of general public demand in the UK at least, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world, that research funded by the taxpayer should be made available, questions of open access and so on. What is the business model for publishers? And they've developed ones which have enabled us to buy things in bulk, but which are no cheaper for us, really. So about 18 months ago, we did briefly suspend the acquisition of some periodicals as part of a school-wide drive to make sure that SOAS lived within its means. We've reinstated that acquisition, and we're continuing to subscribe at a very substantial rate. We jealously guard the library's acquisitions budget and articulate for its increase at every available opportunity, and I'm sure I bore my colleagues across the rest of SOAS with the importance of keeping funding the library. But libraries are an easy target in universities sometimes, and it's a long-term mistake not to make these acquisitions. So yes, we have been a bit affected. We're definitely affected by price increases, and we will continue to be affected by that. And I think it'll get worse as we see an increase in inflation and energy costs and all those other things that will affect the ability of institutions to buy this material. We just have to hope we can carry on doing it.
That makes a lot of sense. That was very thorough. Thanks. So I had another question. I know that the library has a bit of a milestone coming up next year, and there's some celebrations planned. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, well, in October 1973, the Queen Mother opened the library, and next year marks the 50th anniversary, therefore, of that opening of the building. And we intend to mark the occasion by really showcasing the work that we've been doing over the last few years. So by all this mass digitization and really a drive to make that available, we're going to host a series of micro exhibitions around the school. We're going to be doing more public programming in the library itself. And we do really hope to hit this target of having digitized material in more than 150 languages as part of that, those celebrations. We have a SOAS concert series as part of SOAS World Music, and that's part of the library's enterprise. And we also hope later this year to launch the revamped SOAS studios, which are a number of studios in the school for doing podcasts and recordings and recording music, as well as interviews and so on. And SOAS Radio, which is a thing run by the Student Union, which we are very supportive of. So thank you very much for those questions.
Yes, of course. I think that's all we've got. So I will hand it over to Greg now. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you both. What a fascinating discussion you have had today. As alumni ourselves who have spent many, many hours in the SOAS library, it's been really nice just to learn about the history and the importance of what is undoubtedly one of the most beloved features of SOAS. So on behalf of our entire American Friends of SOAS Board of Directors and the SOAS alumni community here in the US, I wish to extend our most sincere gratitude to both of our esteemed and accomplished panelists today for participating in this virtual event. Oliver Urquhart Irvine Director of the SOAS Library. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and your commitment and passion for the important work you do in preserving and sharing the world's knowledge and works in collection at SOAS. And of course, to Ashley Crawford, who is both a SOAS alumna and a current SOAS student, for being our wonderful moderator yet again, and for your generosity in giving your time in support of AFSOAS and SOAS. I would also like to thank my fellow AFSOAS board member and Vice President, Dr. Bharti Kansara, for organizing today's event. If you enjoyed today's discussion, we would appeal to all of you to make a contribution in support of the exceptional academics offered at SOAS. There really is no place in the world quite like it. You can make a tax-deductible contribution on our website at afsoas.org/donate, and earmark your gift for any purpose you see fit, and that includes the SOAS Library. I just provided the web link for that in the chat box right now. Alternatively, as the Association of SOAS Alumni here in the US, AFSOAS offers one scholarship annually to an American student in financial need to study a full-time one-year top master's program at SOAS in London. And to date, we have had 7 John Loyolo AFSOAS scholarship recipients. We would so appreciate your support in any amount of this initiative, and for enabling us to continue to make this opportunity possible. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for making the time to join us for this enlightening discourse. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to the next events. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.